Okay, welcome everyone. Juma Mubarak. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm looking forward to a very exciting talk today. Bunch of speakers that we have. So we have Brother Ahmet, mashallah, who has joined us in the past. He is going to be discussing today the constructing a space for feedback and disagreement, the prophetic example. Mashallah, how much we all need to hear this, mashallah. And Dr. Betsy Mesard will be giving an overview of Muslim ethics, which I'm very much looking forward to. So these two topics go so well hand in hand, mashallah. So thank you again, all of you, for joining us. I love seeing all the faces on video. You know, that's my mantra. So Ahmed, I'm going to turn things over to you and we'll look forward to hearing it.
Wonderful. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much, Timiko. Thank you, everyone. So I think the practice has been to start off with the opening of a regular khutbah, but then transition to a more, sort of, free-flowing discussion. That's what I'll do. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah, nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruh. ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. Allah reminds us in Surah Al-Imran, chapter 3, verse 102, saying, "O you who believe, be mindful of God as His due, and make sure you devote yourselves to Him at your dying moment." And similarly, in Surah Al-Ahzab, chapter 33, verses 70 and 71, Allah reminds us, saying, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما.
Ahmed, I know you're in a public setting. It's a little difficult to hear with some of the background noise. If you could maybe just speak a bit louder.
I'll do that. So to recap on the second verse from chapter 33, verses 70 and 71, Allah says, يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. Saying, believers, be mindful of God, speak in a direct fashion and to good purpose, and He will put your deeds right for you and forgive you your sins. Whoever obeys God and His messenger will truly achieve a great triumph. And to follow on the verses, let's start with the call to be mindful of God. In Surah Al-Anfal, chapter 8, verse 29, Allah says, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, let me just make this a bit bigger. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إن تتقوا الله يجعل لكم فرقانا ويكفر عنكم سيئاتكم ويغفر لكم والله ذو الفضل العظيم. So Allah says, believers, if you remain mindful of God, He will give you a criterion for you to tell the right from the wrong and wipe out your bad deeds for you and forgive you. God's favor is great indeed. So with these verses in mind, and hoping that my voice is coming a bit more clearly now, what I wanted to discuss today is the idea of constructing space for feedback and disagreement in our communities, and to try to look at the prophetic example on that as a reminder for myself and for all of us. We oftentimes remind one another we don't have a uniform community. And we oftentimes focus on the diversity within our communities around language, around race, around ethnicity, which we celebrate as a richness of our community, or which we should do if we are not doing properly. However, while celebrating or trying to celebrate the diversity, we oftentimes also sometimes not pay enough attention to the idea of also diversity of opinions and viewpoints on different issues. And that can then become a drawback that sometimes divides communities or can disrupt the communal feeling. And I wanted to reflect on that and really to try to talk a little bit about how we can approach that process looking at the prophetic example. Obviously, the fact that we all are going through this traumatic time puts additional stress on all of us, on our community. I think that's something we should recognize. And I'm sure Dr. Mesard's talk on Islamic ethics will give us ideas about this as well. And I know that, with Brother Iftikhar, I think, one of the things, the text you've been studying is Dr. Omar's Living Islam with Purpose. And the second principle there is respecting dissent, right? But the focus there is more on religious texts and how there can be different opinions in legal texts as well. So if we look at it a little bit more on our social situation, how can we make our communities, our society more open to feedback? How can we construct space for constructive collective thinking? And how can we make sure that our differences of opinion stay there and do not come to impact our work? Now, some of the verses that we started off with, I'm realizing that this background noise is continuing to be an issue, so I'm trying to speak as loudly as I can. So forgive me for that. The verses that we have started off with, right? So all of them started calling the believers to be mindful. And then, the verse from Surah Al-Ahzab talked about speaking in a direct fashion and to good purpose. Right? So that's one reminder for us in our speech as an act for us to be conscious of our speech, even when we are disagreeing and when we are giving that feedback. And of course, the idea of seeking a criterion, the idea of Furqan, which is in itself a word for the Quran itself, right? That Allah will give us that if we are being mindful of Allah, if we establish this balance between fear and love for Allah, and we are able to adopt it in our lives. One of the observations that I've had over the years working in our communities is that there are passion in our communities. That is something that I think we should celebrate, right? There is sometimes convictions in our communities on certain issues that can be celebrated as well. But at the same time, I think we romanticize even the time of the Prophet as a time of uniform identities or uniform ideas. And I think if we look at that period as in itself a period that had a lot of diversity of opinion, and of course with the realization that even after the death of the Prophet, the community struggled with navigating this idea of dissent, navigating this idea of disagreement, navigating this idea of creating community and preserving community, it will help us overcome some of the discouragements that we face when we come across disagreements or debate in our community. Because not each disagreement, not each debate, not even each sort of, really passionate disagreement is necessarily wrong. And that's something that we can celebrate. And of course, the common examples that we look at from the life of the Prophet that gives us space for his leadership style on how he related to his community and his people and how he created space for that feedback is also important for us, right? So the two common examples of both of them come from that's examples of communal struggle, being faced with war and being faced with a major sort of challenge for the community, right? So from the Battle of Uhud, where the Muslims are debating on what is the best strategy to defend their city. And of course, the Prophet creates that space for people to give opinion on that. And even though it seemed that it was against his own conviction, on his belief, he agreed to go on a defense outside of the city with his community. So, of course, that proved to be a wrong choice for the community, but it was upheld as the communal voice after that being debated. And the second example, of course, comes from the Battle of the Trench from the 4th or the 5th year of the Hijrah, 627, right? when the Muslims are again facing a major challenge, and they are trying to decide on what is the best way to defend the city, Medina. And the opinion that is being adopted comes from someone who was not only an outsider to that community, right? As we know, came from Salman Farisi, someone from outside of the area, but also someone who was a new Muslim, right? So he suggested that digging a trench around the city was a common defensive practice in his own community, and that he suggested that as a tactic. And the Prophet and the believers adopted that, and that became the dominant opinion. So that process of seeking feedback for us, if we try to take it today, not only we see a religious leader, adopting this, someone who is the prophet of God, adopting this and bringing in voices from different groups, but we can also see that it also brings in not intergenerational feedback into the picture. It brings in minority views within the picture. Right? It brings in unconventional practices into the picture. And I think on all of these three levels, we, in our communities, not only Muslim community, but otherwise as well, currently have struggles, because we have oftentimes have not taken into heart the process of giving room to others and giving due credit to others. And that brings me to the concept of humility. And I think that is at the root of some of these ideas, right? The idea of sometimes going back to our own selves, looking at our own thinking and giving credit to others, and not adopting or not thinking that we are always the one who is on the right. And that takes, conscious practice of experiencing or practicing humility, right? So to remind one another of a hadith, and then maybe to try to close with that slowly, is the Prophet used to make a dua, narrated in Tirmidhi, where he would say that, "Oh God, I seek refuge in you from a heart that is not humble, from a prayer that goes unheard, a soul that is not satisfied, and knowledge that is of no use. I seek refuge in you from these four things." So that the core thing being that, one of the first is from a heart that is not humble, from a heart that sees this, possessive dominating the truth or the only opinion, that the right thing. Giving that room to others is, I think, important for our communities, especially in our American Muslim communities, where the diversity is dominant, where differences of opinion is going to be much more dominant, even in regards to legal issues. So that, I think, should be there. And I think to end on a practical note of how we can cultivate it a bit further would be to make sure that we are inserting ourselves into different experiences and different experiential areas. I hear from many people who used to think that there was only one way of praying, there was only one way of making wudu and all. After they go to Hajj, they realize, no, that's really like there are many ways of doing such things, right? That experience in itself can bring in that realization, saying, hey, my truth is not the only truth. And I think that's important for us to celebrate. And I finish there, inshallah, I hope, and look forward to the discussion with the hope that we can base our these words in practice. And it's difficult to do so, but I think inshallah it's possible. I apologize for the noise situation. So I hope that some of it's made its way, and I look forward to Dr. Mesard's presentation. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair, Ahmed. That was wonderful, mashallah. What concise but great reminders. As the Italian Muslim that I have the passion part down pat. It's the humility part that I need to work on, mashallah. So, alhamdulillah, it's a great reminder. And it's nice to hear that, you know, I think we do romanticize the time of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, you know, to think that everything was even keeled and there were, you know, no heated, passionate discussions. But I think when we remember that they did have those heated, passionate discussions, but at the bottom line of those discussions was respect and love for each other. So, you know, when we remember that, mashallah, I think within our own communities, we can get so much further. So Jazakallah khair for that excellent reminder, mashallah. I'm going to turn things over to Sister Tahiyya, who runs our community learning and dialogue program. She'll introduce Betsy into the next segment, inshallah.
Thank you, Sister Nicole. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce Betsy Mesard today. Who recently moved to this area and Villanova University. And can you all hear me? Hello?
You're breaking up a little bit.
Yep, you're breaking up just a bit, but we can hear you now.
Okay, I apologize for that. I don't know what happened, but I was just saying that Dr. Mesard is teaching Islamic ethics at Villanova University and Bryn Mawr University. And I am happy to welcome her today. And she will share with us a really concise and beautiful summary of some of the approaches to ethics in general, and also what does it mean to look at the ethics within Islamic teachings. And I'm much looking forward to that. And this is a topic that kind of triggers or asks many philosophical questions, and I'm sure we'll all have those. And especially in this time when not only are we individually faced with many ethical issues, but we are bombarded by I cannot even call it ethics, but lack of all around us. So it would be great to hear that. And I hope we engage in some questioning. Please go ahead and start. And I look forward to discussion afterwards.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for hosting me, and thank you, Tahiyya, for inviting me. Yeah, hopefully this will speak to what Ahmed talked about, approaches of disagreement. I am always coming at these questions and ethics usually from a comparative perspective, so looking precisely at disagreement and trying to understand it. I'd like to share a PowerPoint because, and I apologize in advance, I think I tried to cover a lot, but hopefully this will help keep some things organized as I go along. So I'm going to talk about ethics as an approach of study. My background is in religious ethics as an academic field, which combines approaches of philosophy, theology, and also intellectual history. So I'm going to emphasize ethics as an approach, not specifically the content of what is good or bad, which is often the way we use the term ethics, but ethics as a kind of reflection on those things. So ultimately, ethics as an approach to study that enables us to make sense of debates about moral problems, understanding what is at stake for the people involved, and identify what is shared and where viewpoints diverge. As a field of study, ethics is defined or delimited in many ways by certain questions. First and foremost, the question of how to live well. How ought I to live? This is not a small question, right? So whenever we ask ourselves and examine in others how this question is answered, then we are doing ethics. So then there are these other questions that have come to define different approaches in ethics. And this especially concerns the academic study of ethics. So if it's not familiar to you, then I completely understand. So the question, what should I aim for, which is associated with teleological ethics from the Greek term telos, which is an end. So in this approach or this way of thinking about questions in ethics, I shape my action according to the goal or the outcome that I have identified as good, the thing that I should aim for. Then I can ask, what are my duties or obligations? And this we call deontological ethics. It's from a Greek term, deon, which means a duty. This is very significant, this approach, in many religious communities. For example, what God has commanded should be done for no other reason than that God has commanded it. So it has this emphasis on duty. Secular philosophers have identified reason as providing us with certain duties or commands. Whatever the source, in this approach, I identify certain principles, rules, or commands to guide me in doing what is right, independent of what the outcome might be. Then we can ask, what kind of person am I, or should I strive to be? And this is virtue ethics. This approach is different from the other two because it is not usually preoccupied with how I should act specifically, but more with questions of character or disposition that inclines us to act in right and good ways. I can do the right thing for the wrong reason. And in some cases, it seems that I can even do the right thing wrongly. I can sort of maneuver through the rules and expectations. So virtue ethics is alert to this, and it shifts the focus from how we act to who we are, whether as individuals or as a community. Most of us use a combination of these modes of reasoning all the time. They are integrated into our decision-making and moral reflection, not always competing with one another, although they can produce tensions for us. And I challenge you, if you can think of any other truly distinctive approach or way of reasoning about how to live well, or do you consider this to be somewhat exhaustive? So these are very fundamental questions. And in some sense, they're very basic. But in answering them and in noticing how others answer them, so many other things come to our attention. We have many different ideas about how to answer these questions. How much can we know through reason alone? And to what extent must we rely on another source, whether that be parents, cultural traditions, society, or the word of God? Or maybe even beyond this, maybe we need to rely on God's intervention in our lives or in history. What sources do we consult? And how do we approach those sources? How do we interpret them? And of course, who gets to do this interpreting? Who has the authority, and how do they get that authority? We can also notice that there are some very fundamental assumptions about the nature of human beings involved in asking and answering these questions in ethics. So for example, it's a question of human nature. Are we good? Can we become good? What does it take to become good? And are we even able to know what is good and what is right? Do we have this capacity for discernment, like Ahmet was discussing? Now, ethics is an English language term with Greek roots, referring to the customs, habits, or manners by which people guide their behavior. The English term morality comes from a Latin term that had a similar meaning. People have tried to differentiate them, but mostly they are synonymous. We can say that ethics is religious when the answers to these questions are sought in sacred sources and the narratives and teachings of a particular faith community. So Islamic ethics will refer to all those approaches to answering this question that what would make ethics Islamic? So it's actually not so straightforward. It could open into another conversation altogether, but I think it's helpful, and most people would find it acceptable to say that Islamic ethics, or ethics is Islamic, when in terms of guidance and questions about how to live, the Quran is taken to be the primary scriptural source, and the Prophet Muhammad is taken to be the central human model. To gain an understanding of how these ways of questioning are approached and categorized in the area of Muslim scholarship and religious knowledge, you would need a whole array of other terms. And I'm really only going to touch on a few of them. The closest, most relevant term is the Arabic akhlaq and the associated ilm al-akhlaq. So this is character and or disposition and the science or study of character formation. The term adab, which is something like manners, refined manners, is also very important historically. And there are others that can be included as well. As tied to these, we are dealing especially with virtue ethics, questions about the formation of the person and the character qualities that enable us to live well and to do what is right. But then there is this term Sharia, the term that is usually translated as Islamic or religious law, but which, as I understand more literally, means the pathway to fulfillment, kind of ultimate fulfillment. Much of what is included as ethics in Christian and other Western philosophical approaches to ethics is encompassed by the textual legal tradition in Islam, and in particular in jurisprudence or fiqh, and especially reflection on the methods and the sources of fiqh, so the usul of fiqh. Because of the centrality of law, the question sometimes arises, well, for any question about action or right living, an answer can be found through understanding the sacred sources, through fiqh. So what is ethics beyond this? If you want to talk about medicine, business, statecraft, or even personal and family life, any of these answers can be arrived at through proper textual study, proper study of the Quran, the Hadith reports, and the established methods and precedents of the scholars. I think we could say that it is the dominant view that ethics and law are one, or at least that they are inseparable. Proper inner disposition is cultivated through proper observance of those obligations set out in Revelation. So, but this is really one very, and of course, very central and important paradigm or approach to understanding, or I call it a stream of thought, to understanding ethics in Islam, the textual legal tradition. So within this paradigm, authority for making judgments belongs to the ulama, the scholars. Knowledge is produced and transmitted within this paradigm in schools devoted to the study of texts and precedents. But there's another paradigm or model for thinking about ethics and moral knowledge, and that is represented by Sufism or Tasawwuf. Within this paradigm, ethics is not simply about knowing what one ought or ought not to do. The task instead is a fundamental transformation of the self, almost as a prerequisite to the kind of knowledge elaborated by the ulama. So on this approach, the plain and accessible meaning of the text is not the exhaustive message of revelation. The knowing, in fact, the knowing and inquiring self can get in the way of other dimensions of moral knowledge. There are meanings and levels of understanding that can only be achieved through practices that in some sense get that self out of the way, the self that says, I want the reward or I don't want the punishment. Knowledge within this stream is produced through bodily and in some cases contemplative practices and through distinctive relationships with a spiritual guide. The organizational setting is not the school or madrasa, but the order or tariqa. So these two paradigms or streams of thought about ethics and their accompanying models of authority and of institutional form had dominated, but both became the subject of internal scrutiny and external criticism, especially starting in the 18th century and into the 19th century. A number of key figures and movements in different geographical centers expressed that things weren't going well. The power of Muslim empires was waning, and this was also the eve of, or the early period of, European colonialism. So there's this feeling that something has been lost or is under threat of being lost. Something has gone wrong, and what can be done to recover and regain a firm foothold? The two terms are important here. So the first, revival, names the tendency to emphasize the need to bring back a lost religious authenticity or spirit. And the term reform names the tendency to advocate for changes to traditional institutional structures. Revival and reform impacted both the ulama or legal scholars and the Sufi orders, each of these again representing different paradigms or approaches to religious and moral knowledge, as well as authority. So there arises this conversation that maybe that there is a problem with the ulama, with their methods and their madrasas, sometimes within these madrasas and among the ulama, and or there's a problem with those funny Sufis, right, and their unusual practices. The textual legal tradition provides a foothold for critique of the Sufis, and Sufism provides a foothold for critique of the textual legal tradition. And again, there was also significant attention to internal reform and self-criticism during this time. But then this other stream of thought enters, modernism. And as an aside, I think it's important to call these paradigms or streams of thought, and in doing this, it's because they're not separate ideologies or sects. In a single individual scholar or figure, you can have someone who is both a textual scholar and a member of a Sufi order, and a modernist or engaged with modernist thinking. Modernism, law, mysticism, these streams intersect and diverge in different patterns and with different individuals and communities. And with more time, I would include other streams, including Salafi, Islamist, and liberal progressive streams, and we could identify others as well. So this modernist stream seriously calls into question both the ulama and Sufism as insufficiently modern, and therefore largely responsible for the failure of Muslims to be united and strong. And this is especially in the context now, the 19th and moving into the 20th century. So this stream of thinking doubts that those models, those authoritative figures are serving as the custodians of religious and moral knowledge in the way that they are supposed to, in a way that actually serves Muslims and guides them to live well. But they do hold the firm conviction that Islam, true Islam, does provide those resources. So this modernist stream is not a critique of Islamic religion, but it is a critique of certain models of authority and moral and religious knowledge. And at least early on, a big part of this comes from the claim, is associated with the claim that these approaches don't see or properly integrate modern science. They don't appreciate it for what it is. Modernists say, if we take Tawheed or God's oneness seriously, then there's only one truth, and we should recognize it and embrace it wherever we find it, including in modern science. The modernist stream emphasizes independent reason and thus emphasizes ijtihad as a tool or method in approaching the texts. There's a sense that one does not need the credentials of some traditional school in order to approach and understand the sacred sources. One only needs some basic linguistic skills, sincere and faithful inquiry, and God-given reason. Significantly, for this stream of thinking, what you do not need is the whole intricate accumulated juridical tradition that has been built up around following precedent and reinforcing what has been done before. So modernists famously accuse ulama of taqlid, a derogatory charge of blindly following what had come before, not truly adapting to actual circumstances and developments in knowledge. They also level the accusation of bid'ah as a derogatory term against Sufis, and this term means a kind of illegitimate innovation in practice. And both of these are supposed to be reasons, accounts for why Muslim societies are not unified and strong. Much of the discussion and debate around ethical issues today can be understood by reference to these streams and the legacy of their interactions. So I think a lot about this period and especially the impact of colonialism in so many Muslim majority societies. There was fragmentation and loss, disenchantment. No matter how real God is to you, once someone has introduced a mechanistic and naturalistic account of the world, you're never the same again. You have to grapple with it. And it takes a different kind of work to find and relate to God. And that's, I see that work in each of these streams in different ways. For so many of the thinkers of these generations through colonialism and post-colonialism, their writing is defined by this sense that something has been lost. So what do we do? How do we live well? What has gone wrong? How did this happen? These are the questions of ethics through this period. How do we move forward? Your account of what went wrong is going to shape the way that you answer the question of how to move forward and how to try to live well. So differences in these accounts produce different conclusions about how to act moving forward. For most of the thinkers and movements exemplifying these streams, these answers have formed in a context where European powers had disrupted, dismantled, and fundamentally transformed previously existing institutions, including schools and universities, as well as legal and administrative customs and institutions. And those are things that really shape who we are. So it's not that simple to say, let me recover what was lost. We've already been shaped by change, and there's so much that we bring to the recovery effort, including the pain and trauma of the loss, and as well as distinctive hopes and desires. And there have also been gains, so there's ambivalence usually. So I'll close. And I know that I have missed some chats. I hope I'm not taking too long, but I'll close with an analogy that has helped me and in some cases my students to make sense of this context for ethics and understanding ethical debates today. It's definitely imperfect, but let's see if it resonates. So let's say there was a place where people had been making music using violins, flutes, and tambourines for generations. And then somebody came in and said, here are trombones. You will only make music with trombones from now on. So you're like, okay, that looks like an interesting instrument. I'll check it out, but this isn't how we make music. we'll keep our instruments. Thank you very much. And they say, you can't now. Trombones are better, and also we have cannons. Okay, so we only have trombones now. So then you start to play the trombone. You use your musical knowledge, but all you have is a trombone. So now later, you might kick those trombone tyrants out, and now you're free to make music in your own way again. But you still only have trombones. And even if you melt them down and make them into violins, flutes, and tambourines again, you will never be playing the same music. Your music will always produce a sound that's inflected by that disruption. And some of you might even like the trombone now and do unique and creative things with it. And if you're one of those people, you wouldn't really appreciate that one guy who comes in and says, no trombones ever anymore. Only this weird flute that I made from melted down trombones. So I think most of us, don't want to be told that we must give up the way that we've always done things, but similarly, it can feel strange to be pressured to do things strictly and only in the way that they were done before. So ethics finally becomes a lens through which to make sense of disagreement and debate between others, as well as within ourselves, our own ambivalences. We're trying to make music, to live well, and to be true to what we have committed ourselves to, using the instruments that we actually have. So I hope this can be some useful tools, and thank you for your time. And I'll be interested to hear from you and discuss.
Thank you so much, mashallah. That was amazing. Sister Tahia, would you like to lead some Q&A on this? And then we do have a question on Ahmed's discussion as well. So when we're finished this, we can revert back to that.
Great. Yes. Well, thank you both very, very much. This is a perfect balance of presentations today. So they really do speak to each other. And a couple of questions came to my mind, and I think it's one of the questions I would like to ask you later is very much discussed in our communities. But I just want to comment on, you were talking about sort of history and different contexts of different approaches, including colonialism and post-colonialism. And then I feel like we have a new context here in America where all this sort of came together when so many different communities ended up in one space. And I think this is the time when so much discussion is happening, at times very uncomfortable discussion, but very important discussion. And I think applying these approaches and rules of ethics and disagreement with respect are crucial at this moment, because I feel like something, this conversation is so important that is happening right now. And you both address that in different ways. What I just wanted to go back to what you mentioned, the two main approaches in Islamic ethics, Sharia and Tasawwuf. If you can just tell us a little bit more about, are they viewed as mutually exclusive? And if not, how is one integrated into another? Just because usually they feel like they're on two opposite ends of the spectrum, and that sometimes it creates so much of discussion in the community. So if you can just speak to that. And the other question, if we get to it, if we have time, would be to, I was wondering if different ethical approaches that you listed in the field of ethics, if Sharia or Tasawwuf falls more under one or the other approach, if we could kind of define it within the field of ethics a little bit more. So if you can just, and then Brother Ahmed, I think there are more questions that you would address. Thank you.
So thanks for those reflections and questions, and I'll try not to take up very much time. Those approaches, certainly in the way that I present them, I do not intend to imply that they're mutually exclusive. And from my study throughout the majority of the history of Islam, they're not viewed as in conflict, but more complementary. Although some people are more devoted to one model or the other, I think for the majority of people, these are different. They're different models, and they address different aspects of the whole person and the question of how to live. But during this period of time, there arose, I think, an intensified sense that they were in opposition to one another, and there was, you know, some figures who really targeted more that I think that the Tasawwuf came more under attack for its practices from the scholars, from the legal scholars. And like, I didn't have the impression that it is a balanced launching of criticisms. But still in this period, you know, some of the figures who are most well known as even modernist legal scholars were also members of Sufi orders, at least for some period. So, and then I think that although there was criticism, this criticism in many cases was part of self-reflection and changes that took place. So, so yeah, I don't see those streams nor modernism as involving separate people, like here is one Sufi and here is one modernist. But you see these understandings animating even individual thinkers or individual movements in different ways. The question about the teleological or goal-oriented ethics, duty-oriented ethics, virtue ethics, I think the textual legal tradition certainly, like law in general, is almost a paradigmatic case of ethics as deontological. So you ask the question, what must I do? I refer to the law. But within fiqh, there are elements of the study that are goal-oriented. So for example, the question of the maqasid is one way in which this tradition aligns with this kind of teleological way of reasoning. And some principles, like I think the principle of maslaha is also an example of the incorporation of teleological ethics. So we can think differently about the rule or the law according to this principle that we seek to uphold, that we aim for. Sufism is thoroughly, I think, steeped in virtue ethics. But I mean, it's interesting, you know, both of these paradigms are really centered on the metaphor of a path, which, you know, brings to mind this, you know, we're aiming for something, and we're ordering our action and ourselves according to that thing that we seek to arrive at.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Mesard.
Thank you, Betsy. I really appreciate that. That was excellent, mashallah. Ahmed, could you address Sister Hiba's comment and question that she had? And if for everyone's benefit, those who are watching on Facebook Live, Sister Hiba said, Jazakallah khair, Brother Ahmed. I love these beautiful reminders. Seeking feedback or disagreements can benefit, not harm our community. I'm interested in hearing where you think our unhealthy attitudes about dissent come from. I wonder if it's connected to a fear of instability and fitna, it's not accidental that so many Muslim organizations and masjids in the US revolve around the authority of a single person and that person's monopoly on authority in order to maintain the semblance of unity of the community. This is a very timely question, mashallah. Your words remind me of how unity comes through the hard work of including and integrating divergent views. Allahu ya'lam.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dr. Hiba, for that question, and thank you, Betsy, for the wonderful presentation. I really benefited it. It's a very nice sort of summary, and I also look forward to hearing more. Dr. Hiba's question is a loaded question. I think it would take us quite a long time to really unpack a lot of things. But a few thoughts come to my mind, and I'm sure maybe some of you have additional thoughts. One is, yes, there is the issue of this charismatic leadership, right? So where there's charismatic leadership, oftentimes there are these kind of issues that pop up, and it's not singular to the Muslim community. I know of a lot of churches, of different congregations similarly, or nonprofits really struggle from that weakness of depending on charismatic leaders and then navigating the leadership of style of those people. So I think that is one thing to acknowledge. Second is really at the same time, this passion or our fear of instability and fitness, as you put, Dr. Hiba, is really something that comes from, I think, an unhealthy reading of Muslim history. And again, kind of goes back to that romanticization, because, we can easily paint every disagreement or criticism or a challenge as fitna, as disability, but at the same time, how do we keep the balance? And I think the third thing is really not merely or specific or unique to Islam or Muslims, but it's really like our times. Like, there is a lot of absolutism in our times, and look at especially online discussions, this for the world, and even some of the everyday language that we use kind of follows that, right? So I think all of those combined, there are these issues, but what I have found is really lack of conscious attention to creating that space, right? And not having institutional frameworks in place to really, bring that forth, right? So are we, as institutions, not only as mosque institutions, are we, if we are running a nonprofit, if we are doing something at home, right, in our own family, are we creating that space for feedback? Are we creating that welcoming environment? I think that really goes everywhere. And I will also be careful to not merely structure it as a generational thing, because we sometimes also, in the same way that we romanticize Muslim history, we sometimes romanticize either the youth or the old, in the way that we go to the extremes of attaching positive, negative values to these. I think like a lot of this discussion came to the fore when there was this vivid discussion of the unmosqued sort of phenomenon, like but there was a documentary and all of that. It did came forth. There's still a lot of need to discuss on, is there gender access in our institutions, if you're talking about mosque institutions. And I think some of the issues over there is really that monopoly and that charisma and lack of institutionalization. But I think broader issues that come from our society, community, and our approach to our history are at the roots of these issues. And the looking at the institutions that I know of who were able to overcome some of these issues, they took a painful process of really installing practices, starting from small to large, not necessarily first attacking the big picture, of incorporating process of listening, right? Listening sessions, bringing in forth ideas, maybe sometimes also seeking professional help in navigating those issues. There are a lot of experts who navigate the conflict within the nonprofit world, for example, right? I mean, if you're talking about that. And of course, I mean, if you ask me, much of that goes to that idea of, you know, tazkiyah and disciplining of oneself, and always us checking ourselves on that, you know, humility, and on that question of, am I violating someone's right, even though I might be right? You know, is it worth violating someone's right? And some may find it also another form of romanticization, but I have benefited myself from that kind of, you know, thinking. This is not to deny that we will have different personalities. Some of us will be more passionate, some of us will be more withdrawn. But again, I think it takes a lot of that practice. So I hope that helps, but I'm sure that many of you have more to share on that. I think, and I may add on that, is bringing in lived experiences into our debates on these kind of issues, putting forth who benefited from what kind of practice, what were some real life experiences. I think that really helps in thinking around this collectively.
MashaAllah. Thank you, Ahmed. MashaAllah. Sister Hiba, that answers your question, I'm assuming? Yep. Okay, great. Thank you, MashaAllah. You know, it's important to note that at Mainline Muslim Society, one of the things we are looking, and the board is looking to incorporate into its foundation, is listening to the community. You know, we've always asked for your feedback, and we encourage feedback from the community. You know, we are a fledgling organization and are looking for, what do you want from your masjid? What do you want from your community? What sort of programming are you interested in? How would you like to see leadership involved in the community? So please provide your feedback. We have multiple accesses of ways to contact us now, whether it's via email or social media. Please provide your feedback. How do you like the Khateras? Are you liking the topics that we're providing? Is there other programming you'd like to see? Please do that. So this way, this top-down leadership approach is not something that the board of Mainline Muslim Society is looking to have. They are really looking for a community-based approach. So please provide your feedback as often and as passionately as possible, inshallah. So thank you to our speakers, Ahmet and Betsy. Thank you, Jazakallah khair, to both of you for your time. We can't tell you how honored we are to have you both and appreciate it. Betsy, welcome to the community. We look forward to seeing more of you. And inshallah, you'll come back and speak to us again often, inshallah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So I'd like to just close with dua, inshallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us all this week to use our ethical standards with one another, to approach one another with open ears and open hearts. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you. May He keep you all healthy and guide us to be a cohesive community seeking His pleasure, inshallah. Ameen. Enjoy this beautiful day. Please get outside and absorb some of the sunshine that I rarely do. But I would really like to, so I can stop taking vitamin D supplements instead of getting out in the sun. So missing all of that with my favorite pumpkin spice lattes. So I'll be doing some of that this weekend, inshallah. So I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Juma Mubarak again to you all. I look forward to seeing you next week. We have some great speakers lined up for next week as well. It's October 30th next weekend, and we have story time on the 31st with Sister Gulmaki reading her own book. So please plan to join us for both events. Looking forward to seeing you all. Juma Mubarak. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for coming.